Hello, I'm Fayaz-Torshizi, and today I'm going to talk about coarse-grained molecular dynamics study of the self-assembly of Triblock Bolaamphiphiles with the SAFT-γ Mie coarse-grained force field. Thanks for having me in this session. Calamitic liquid crystals are ubiquitous in nature. These are rod-like molecules that have very useful properties, particularly in the industry as well, in terms of their optical properties, such as their use in TV displays and sunglasses, the charge-carrying properties, particularly useful in photovoltaics, because of the pi conjugation, for example, that is common in many of them, and also the viscous properties. These can be used in biotechnology and in skincare, particularly the smectic phase, where the anisotropy of the molecules leads to different textures, in essence. As I mentioned before, the anisotropy plays a big part in the sense that it determines the phase behavior. As you can see, for example, here, for p-terphenol, a common liquid crystal, if you increase the density or the pressure of the system, particles start aligning themselves in a certain direction called the director. Upon further packing or increasing the pressure, molecules can then form smectic layering, where they have basically not only alignment but also layering in them. These can be quite well characterized by order parameters such as the nematic order parameter or the smectic order parameter. That makes them quite easy to model, and there have been many studies to understand the behavior and the theories that can describe the behavior quite well. However, adding degrees of freedom makes prediction of phase behavior of these molecules, calamitic liquid crystals, quite difficult. One such example is the case of polyphilic Bolaamphiphiles. So what I mean by that is that if we start with a calamitic liquid crystal like this, we add more complex functional groups to the end, so two functional groups that are very strongly hydrogen bonding. This molecule becomes a Bolaamphiphiles. Now, if we add this lateral side chain to this Bolaamphiphiles, basically a backbone with two end groups, we have a polyphilic Bolaamphiphiles. What I mean by that is that none of these functional groups prefer to interact with the other functional groups. They'd rather interact with themselves, leading to a polyphilic phase behavior, as I will demonstrate in a second. But what you have basically is that these groups forming strong hydrogen bonding, this backbone liking to interact with itself, and this side chain trying to disrupt smectic layering. Therefore, the variety in the choice of all these functional groups makes these molecules very, very rich in complex phase behavior. I'll demonstrate an example. The most common Bolaamphiphiles is the T-shaped Bolaamphiphiles, where what you have is that you just have a linear chain as the lateral side chain here. Upon increasing the length of this lateral side chain, initially you start with a smectic layering because of the very strong attraction of the hydrogen bonding groups at the ends. But once you start adding this lateral side chain, you start getting columnar phases, 2D periodic columnar phases, where you have with small amounts you could have triangular phases, square columnar, pentagonal, hexagonal, and all the way you could go to the lamellar phase. And as you could see, you have very interesting 2D periodic structures with good pi conjugation, leading to good charge transfer properties, anisotropic charge transfer properties. Even more complicated phase behavior can be observed in these molecules. So here I'm demonstrating a recently discovered phase behavior of these molecules, where instead of having a T-shaped Bolaamphiphiles, what you have is actually, you could branch this lateral side chain into basically different length alkanes. The interesting thing is with this is that you actually don't change the size of the volume of the lateral side chain, you just change the degree of branching, and what you get is very beautiful superlattices. You go from a hexagonal columnar phase into a superlattice formed of hexagons and pentagons, and you could go to superlattices of octagons and pentagons for the symmetric case. For the asymmetric case, you have a hexagonal symmetry. For the symmetric case, you have a rectangular symmetry. So, given the versatility of these BAs, exploring the phase space is particularly challenging. If you want to do theoretical modeling, these are always limited to very simple systems, just pure calorimetrics, not these types of systems where you have you can't really access the free energy easily. Experimental studies can be also quite laborious because you have to then synthesize first, run the experiments, and then develop tools to characterize these phases. This is where molecular simulations can be quite useful. We would like to develop molecular simulations models, so to predict self-assembly of T-shaped and branched Bolaamphiphiles. But in order to do this, one has to ask, how can we at best represent these Bolaamphiphiles? You can always start with an all-atom or united atom models, but these molecules tend to be very large, each composed of say 100 atoms, more than 100 atoms each, and you want say like 800 of these molecules. So you could see that you need very large systems and you need to run them for very long to get good equilibration to be able to observe any phase behavior. These are why atomistic models have not been popular in simulating these molecules. There have been phenomenological models, such as these are the most common ones, such as using a DPD potential or basically a toy model potential using hard spheres with only the end groups having any attraction. These are very fast, they equilibrate very efficiently, but they could only paint a qualitative picture of the phase behavior of the system. For example, the one key assumption in all these models that have been done before is that all segments have the same size, but for example, you can't really assume that a benzene ring has the same size as for example, a glycerol group. So therefore, there are certain assumptions that can be improved. Nevertheless, they're quite good. And what we want to propose is something that we could actually predict the phase behavior with quantitative accuracy. What I mean by that is, for example, for us to be able to get the lattice parameters, for us to be able to get transition temperatures, quantitative agreements with experiments. And to do that, we do first, we come up with the SAFT method, where we model molecules as a group contribution method. So we assume that our liquid crystal molecule is composed of different functional groups. In terms of functional groups, we have basically a rigid backbone that can be assumed to be formed of, for example, p-terphenyl. We have sticky end groups, as I mentioned, hydrogen bonding groups. They look like a glycerol group, and we have the lateral side chain that, for example, has like a sum of 20, so we could assume that, okay, we have an icosane, so C20 alkane. Now, in order to do this, what we say, we assume that we have tangentially bonded spheres, so spherical models, coarse-grained, where for p-terphenyl, for example, we could assume that each benzene ring is a coarse-grained segment. For glycerol groups, we could assume that every COH group is basically a coarse-grained segment. And for icosane, we could assume that it's composed of, say, 6 segments of tangentially bonded spheres. The good thing about this is that we could then use an equation of state called the SAFT equation of state, based on the statistical associating fluid theory, to predict the properties, to obtain optimal parameters, basically coarse-grained parameters for these molecules, for these models. This equation of state is very suited for this. And we could then only need a tiny bit of atomistic simulations to define the rigidity in these molecules. So what I mean by the equation of state to get, how can we use an equation of state to get intermolecular potential parameters? The way this works is that actually we have an equation of state where we have access to the free energy. Now, this equation of state is a molecular-based one, so it first assumes that every molecule you have in the system is composed of monomers, and these monomers are ideal gases. That's the first contribution. Once it assumes that, then actually it says no, these monomers are not really ideal gases anymore. These are actually molecules that interact using dispersion interactions. So these dispersion interactions could be Leonard-Jones, or they can be more versatile, as I'll demonstrate in a second. And then finally it says, okay, no, actually molecules are not just simple monomers, they're actually chains of monomers. So there is a contribution to the free energy based on this assumption as well. And once we have that, we again have this equation of state assumes that molecules, these chains, are tangentially bonded spheres. So the good thing about this equation of state is that the input parameters to the equation of state are actually the Mie potential parameters. So they're basically intermolecular potential parameters that are very similar to Leonard-Jones parameters. They just have a variable, a repulsive exponent. They're basically the same as Leonard-Jones interactions. So we take experimental data, we use the equation of state to find this epsilon, sigma, and lambda, and then we could use the parameters of simulations. If they're bad, we could feed this back in, and then we could obtain this. As you can see, excellent agreement is observed between simulations, molecular simulation experiments, and the equation of states. So we could see that our methodology is robust, and we could again get intramolecular potential parameters using a Boltzmann inversion using of a harmonic potential. So the interesting thing here, as you could see, is that we could predict the phase behavior of these molecules, Bolaamphiphiles, by just fitting the parameters to beta-phenyl, glycerol, and AIChE. This is very nice. It might be a bit difficult to explain the graph now, but firstly, what we say is that, okay, we have this coarse-grained representation of this molecule. This is a T-shaped Bolaamphiphiles formed of these three functional groups. And what we do is we change the length of this side chain. So we go from 3, which is this bottom one, you could see, and then we have 4, and then we go to 6, 4, 5, and 6. The interesting thing here is that this number 3 corresponds to a certain number of carbons that there are experimentally observed information about. You could see it into source 1. And for example, the top row in each of these corresponds to the experimental observations, and the bottom row corresponds to our work. The interesting thing is, so the checkered, the big squares, the diamonds, correspond to crystalline phases. These little diamonds correspond to liquid crystalline phases, and you could see the transition temperatures along the x-axis. For the case where we have only 4 segments or 3 segments, we have a square columnar phase. You could see that here. It's very nice. Both models agree quite well. For the case where we have 5 segments here, like this example, again, we get pentagonal columnar phases as observed in experiments, and this is a very good agreement as well. The transition temperatures are well captured. There's only a bit of discrepancy between this one, but this could be due to the level of coarse graining that we do. Interestingly, we could also, if we increase the chain length, we go into the hexagonal columnar phase. So what I mean by that is that we go from basically, we start with a random configuration, we let the system equilibrate, and we could get a hexagonal columnar phases. The interesting thing, as I mentioned before, is that our models are quantitatively accurate. What I mean by that is that we could actually get the lattice length using the radial distribution functions, for example, the 2D planar one, and we could actually get a peak of 4.2 corresponding to the lattice length, which is exactly the same as the experimentally observed one. And we get the transition temperatures in quantitatively agreement with the experiments. Not only do we get them for the T-shaped one, but for branched Bolaamphiphiles, we get extremely complex phase behavior as observed from simulations, and these are pure predictions as compared with experiments. These are extremely long simulations as well, and what we do here is we take that hexagonal columnar phase, the molecule we had, we take one chain and we put it to the top. That's exactly what we do. So here we had 6 chains, now we have 5 and 1. And if you actually see this, we start with a random configuration, we get this. This is what is observed using the electron microscopy, and you could actually see that, okay, each of these rosebuds has a hexagonal columnar phase by another hexagon where there are 6 pentagons in them, and then you have 12 pentagons around them. This is exactly what we observe as well in our simulations. We get the exact same phase behavior. This is also true for symmetric ones, where we experimentally they observe columnar phases of octagons with pentagons. What we see as well, we get layers of pentagons and we get octagons as well. So we again capture the correct self-assembling structure, lattice lengths are correctly captured, there are only ever so slightly structures to the experimental ones, and transition temperatures are also in quantitative agreements with experiments. So what we propose is a top-down coarse graining methodology to study self-assembly of liquid crystals. It is shown that the methodology is suited to the system studied, and the methodology outperforms other available ones in predicting material properties with quantitative accuracy. However, the simulation times can be quite long, and this would be part of the future for us to be able to refine the models developed. So thank you. If you'd like to read more about this, our paper has made the journal cover of MSDE, and we would welcome you to have a discussion with us and to take this further. Thank you. Have a